The pistol hit the mud before Ernesto Domenico even realized his fingers had opened. For 30 years, that weapon had been an extension of his hand, an instrument of persuasion that had built an empire on the graves of men who'd underestimated him. But now it lay half-submerged in the filth of the slums he'd crawled out of, abandoned like a toy a child had outgrown. The boy standing before him didn't flinch at the sound. Ernesto had come to collect a blood debt. The kind written in the old language, the kind that demanded settlement regardless of mercy or circumstance. His intelligence said the debtor had a son, a loose end, a piece of leverage that would draw out whoever was hiding from Domenico justice. What his intelligence hadn't mentioned was that the boy would have Ernesto's own face. 8 years old, maybe 9, dressed in rags that barely qualified as clothing, barefoot in the muck, kneeling with a handful of crumpled, worthless bills clutched in his small fists like they were sacred texts. The child looked up, and Ernesto saw his own dark eyes staring back at him across 3 decades, the same widow's peak, the same scar above the left eyebrow, the same stubborn set of the jaw that had once gotten Ernesto's father killed in this very alley. "This is all my mother has," the boy said, his voice steady despite the tears carving tracks through the dirt on his face. "She says a Domenico never runs from what's owed." The words hit harder than any bullet Ernesto had ever taken. Behind him, his men shifted uncomfortably, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. Around them, the slum held its breath, sensing something fundamental had just broken in the architecture of their world. Ernesto crouched down until he was eye level with the impossible. "What's your name?" he heard himself whisper. "Matteo. The name I would have given my son." And in that moment, the most feared man in the city understood that someone he trusted had stolen everything that mattered, and now he would burn the entire kingdom down to get it back. Ernesto didn't retrieve the pistol. Not yet. Instead, he studied the boy with the cold precision he usually reserved for interrogations. Every detail catalogued. The way Matteo held himself, weight on the back foot, ready to run but refusing to. The fresh bruise on his left arm, defensive from blocking something. The hunger that made his cheekbones sharp beneath skin too tan from working in the sun. "You know who I am," Ernesto said. "Yes." No hesitation. "Then you know what happens to people who try to pay blood debts with paper." Matteo's jaw tightened. That gesture again. The one Ernesto saw in the mirror every morning. "My mother says you can only take what a person has. We have nothing but this and our name." "Our name." "Your mother," Ernesto said carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't since he was the boy's age. "What's her name?" "Maria. Maria Castellano." The slum spun. Maria. The girl with cold dark eyes who'd promised to wait for him. The girl Lorenzo had told him married a merchant and moved north 15 years ago, wanting nothing to do with the monster Ernesto had become. Except she hadn't moved. She was here. And this boy. "How old are you?"
8.
"Almost 9. The mathematics carved themselves into Ernesto's brain with brutal precision. 9 months after their last night together. 9 months after Lorenzo arranged his promotion that required leaving the slums immediately. 9 months after the letters stopped coming. Ernesto reached out slowly, his hand, stained with more blood than he could count, trembling as it touched the scar above Matteo's eyebrow. "Where did you get this?" "Fell off the dock last summer. Mama said it makes me look like..." The boy stopped, his eyes widening with sudden understanding. "Like your father," Ernesto finished, his voice breaking. "Where's she, Matteo? Where's your mother?" Something terrible flickered across the boy's face. Not fear. Grief. "The infirmary. She's..." Matteo's voice cracked. "The doctors say the sickness in her lungs will take her soon. Maybe days." Ernesto rose to his feet, his expensive suit ruined, his carefully constructed world crumbling. "Take me to her."
Now.
The infirmary was a converted warehouse that smelled of carbolic acid and desperation. Ernesto's presence sent nurses scattering like startled birds, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the thin curtain at the far end, behind which Mateo had disappeared. When he pulled it aside, the past reached up and dragged him under. Maria lay on a rusted bed frame, her body so wasted by consumption that she seemed more ghost than woman. But her eyes, those dark, infinite eyes that had once made him believe he could be something more than a weapon, opened when she heard his footsteps. Ernesto. Not a question, just his name, spoken the way she'd once breathed it against his neck in the summer darkness. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare at what time and poverty and his own abandonment had done to her. I tried to tell you, Maria whispered, each word costing her. I sent so many letters. You never answered. I received nothing. Ernesto's voice was gravel and broken glass. Lorenzo said you'd married, that you wanted. Lorenzo. Her laugh was a terrible sound, wet and rattling. Your faithful consigliere came here himself, Ernesto, right after you left. Said if I ever contacted you again, he'd kill my family, my mother, my little brother, everyone I loved. The floor tilted beneath Ernesto's feet. He said you needed to become hard, that I was making you weak, that the family needed a weapon, not a man. Maria coughed, blood flecking her lips. So I stayed silent. I raised our son in the same mud you escaped. I taught him your name like a prayer and a warning. Ernesto's knees hit the concrete beside her bed. How long, he managed. The doctors say a week. Maybe less. She reached for his face with shaking fingers, touching him the way she had 3 decades ago. But you found him. You found Mateo. That's what matters. It's not enough. Ernesto caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. Maria, I swear. Lorenzo will come for him, she interrupted, her grip suddenly fierce despite her weakness. The moment I'm gone, he'll see Mateo as a threat. You know how your world works, Ernesto. Loose ends don't survive. She was right. God help him, she was right. If you're hooked on Ernesto's story, hit that like button. Subscribe to see how he protects his son from the empire he built. Drop a comment below. Do you think Ernesto can defeat Lorenzo? Let's discuss. Ernesto's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower that overlooked the city like a god surveying ants. Lorenzo Russo sat in the leather chair he'd occupied for 23 years, sipping espresso as if this were any ordinary morning. He looked up when Ernesto entered, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit immaculate. You look terrible, Lorenzo observed. The Slum collection shouldn't have taken all night. Ernesto said nothing. He'd left Mateo with Maria, had spent the darkness sitting in that infirmary chair, watching his son sleep against his dying mother, replaying every moment of the past 30 years through a new, sickening lens. He crossed to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a bundle of yellowed envelopes. 63 letters, all sealed, all addressed to him in Maria's careful handwriting. He'd found them in Lorenzo's private safe at 4 a.m. The safe only 3 people knew existed. Strange, Ernesto said conversationally, dropping the letters onto the desk between them. I was looking for the Genovese contracts last night. Found these instead. Lorenzo's espresso cup paused halfway to his lips. Ernesto. 63 letters from a dead woman. Ernesto's voice was pleasant, almost friendly, which made it more terrifying than any shout. Except she's not dead, is she, Lorenzo? She's dying now, but she wasn't dead then. You just told me she was. I made you a king. Lorenzo set down his cup with forced calm. That girl and her bastard would have made you a man. Kings don't have the luxury. My son, Ernesto interrupted quietly. Say it correctly. My son. The heir you've spent 8 years pretending doesn't exist. Lorenzo stood, smoothing his suit with practiced ease. That boy is a liability. The commission will see him as. The commission will see what I tell them to see. Ernesto rounded the desk, moving with the predatory grace that had made him legend. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to disappear. Take your accounts. Take your contacts. But if I ever see you again, you'll what? Lorenzo's mask cracked, revealing the calculating monster beneath. Kill me? You built this empire on my counsel, Ernesto. Every strategic move, every calculated risk, every decision that made you powerful came through me. Without me, you're just another thug from the slums. Ernesto smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Then I guess I'll be a thug with a son. The apartment was one of a dozen Ernesto kept scattered throughout the city, clean, anonymous, stocked with cash and weapons and everything needed to disappear. He'd never imagined bringing his child here. Mateo stood in the doorway, still wearing his ragged clothes, his small frame dwarfed by the sterile luxury. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the infirmary, since Maria had made Ernesto promise to keep their son alive, to teach him how to be strong without becoming cold. You can sleep there, Ernesto said, gesturing to the bedroom. There's food in the kitchen, clothes in the closet. They'll be too big, but... Why? Mateo's voice cut through the awkward speech. Why what? Why does your friend want me dead? I never did anything to him. Ernesto crouched down, meeting his son's eyes, his own eyes. In my world, you don't have to do anything wrong to be dangerous. You just have to exist and threaten the wrong people's power. That's stupid. Despite everything, Ernesto almost smiled. Yes, it is. Mama says you used to be different. Before. Mateo moved further into the room, his bare feet silent on the expensive tile. She says you used to believe in things besides debts and fear. Your mother remembers a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. Then why are you helping me? The boy's voice was small but fierce. If you're just debts and fear, why didn't you shoot me in the alley? Because you have my face. Because your mother loved me when I was still human. Because I've spent 30 years building an empire on bones, and I just realized I have nothing to show for it except a tower of glass and a heart full of ashes. Because, Ernesto said carefully, some debts can't be paid with blood. Mateo studied him for a long moment, those two old eyes searching for truth in his father's face. Mama says you'll have to fight your own people to keep me safe. She says they'll kill you for choosing me. Your mother is probably right. Then why? Because you're my son. The words felt foreign in Ernesto's mouth, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. And I've already lost 8 years. I'm not losing the rest. The war is coming. Like if you want to see Ernesto take on his own empire. Subscribe for the next chapter. Things are about to get bloody. Comment. Can a monster become a father? Share your thoughts. They came at midnight. Not with guns drawn or a threat shouted, but with the quiet inevitability of judgment. 5 men in expensive suits, representing the 5 families that ruled the city's underworld. They sat around Ernesto's conference table like a tribunal, their faces carved from the same stone that had built empires. Lorenzo sat among them. Of course he did. We've reviewed the situation, Don Castellano said. No relation to Maria, just a cruel coincidence. The boy is a complication we cannot afford. Ernesto stood at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the mahogany surface. The boy is my son. The boy is a weakness. This from Don Vitelli, a man whose own sons had died in the wars Ernesto had orchestrated. Lorenzo has explained how this woman manipulated you, how the child is likely not even. He is mine. Ernesto's voice could have cut glass. I've seen the dates. I've seen his face. I know. Then you understand, Lorenzo said smoothly, why the Commission cannot allow this to continue. Your enemies will use him against you. Your allies will see your sudden sentimentality as a sign of weakness. The empire you built will crumble because you discovered you have a bastard in the slums. Ernesto looked at each man in turn, reading the verdict in their eyes. They'd already decided. This meeting was just theater. The Commission offers you a choice, Don Castellano continued. Prove your loyalty remains with the family. Eliminate the complication yourself, publicly, and your position remains secure. Or, Ernesto asked, though he already knew. Or, we eliminate you both. Tonight. Cleanly. Lorenzo leaned forward. I built you, Ernesto. I can just as easily erase you. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall, each second marking off what remained of Ernesto's old life. Finally, he smiled, that terrible, cold smile that had preceded so many deaths. I choose the boy. The Commission members exchanged glances. Surprise even. Men like Ernesto didn't choose suicide. Then you understand what happens next, Don Vitelli said. Perfectly. Ernesto pushed back from the table, his movements casual, almost lazy. You'll send a team to the safe house. You'll expect me to be there, defending him. You'll overwhelm us both with numbers and firepower. Clean. Efficient. Business. Yes, Lorenzo said. That's exactly what will happen. Good. Ernesto walked to the door, then paused. I just have one question. What? Do you remember what I was before you made me king? Lorenzo's smile faltered. A thug. A street rat with delusions. A survivor, Ernesto corrected. And survivors don't play by your rules. He left before they could respond, the door closing behind him with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. Mateo was still awake when Ernesto returned, sitting by the window with a kitchen knife clutched in his small hands. They're coming, the boy said. Not a question. Yes. Ernesto pulled a duffel bag from the closet, began filling it with weapons, cash, documents. We have maybe 2 hours before the hit squad arrives. Maybe less. Where are we going? Somewhere they won't expect. Ernesto tossed a child-sized jacket toward Mateo. Still too big, but better than nothing. The slums. Mateo's eyes widened. That's the first place they'll... Look, yes. But not the first place they'll find us. Ernesto zipped the bag, checked his watch. Your mother grew up in those streets. She knew every hiding place, every bolt hole, every route the police couldn't follow. She told me about them once, before I became this. He gestured at himself, the expensive suit, the weapons, the empire of violence written into every line of his face. She told me because she believed I'd need them someday to help people escape men like me. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They left through the service entrance, avoiding cameras and doormen, moving through the city like ghosts. Ernesto had spent 3 decades learning how to be seen, how to make his presence impossible to ignore. Now he had to remember how to disappear. The slums swallowed them whole. They moved through passages so narrow Ernesto had to turn sideways, through courtyards where laundry hung like flags of surrender, through spaces that existed in the gaps between official maps. Mateo led now, his small frame navigating obstacles Ernesto couldn't squeeze through, his knowledge of the terrain surpassing his father's despite 3 decades of difference. Here, the boy whispered, stopping before what looked like a collapsed wall. Behind it, a passage. They crawled through into darkness that smelled of damp stone and secrets. The space opened into a cellar that hadn't appeared on city records since before Ernesto was born. "Mama and I stayed here sometimes," Mateo said quietly. "When the rent collectors came. When men like," he stopped. "Men like me," Ernesto finished.
Yeah.
They sat in the darkness, listening to the city hunt for them above. Sirens.
Shouts.
The organized chaos of a manhunt orchestrated by people who knew every trick Ernesto had ever used. Except this one. Dawn found them still hidden, still breathing. Mateo had finally fallen asleep against Ernesto's side, his small body curled into a defensive ball, even in rest. Ernesto stayed awake, one hand on his pistol, the other resting carefully on his son's shoulder. He'd spent the night thinking about Maria's words. "You used to believe in things besides debts and fear." When had that changed? When had he stopped being the boy who'd promised to escape the slums and return for the girl he loved, and become the monster who'd forgotten she existed? The answer, he knew, sat in a glass tower overlooking the city. Lorenzo, the architect of Ernesto's transformation, the sculptor who'd chiseled away everything soft until only the weapon remained. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stop running. Give us the boy."
Live.
Ernesto deleted it. Another message. "Think about what you're throwing away. Your empire. Your legacy. All of it gone for a bastard from the slums." He almost laughed. Legacy. What legacy? A throne built on corpses? A reputation for brutality? Money that would be divided among jackals the moment he died? Mateo stirred against him, mumbling something in his sleep. Ernesto looked down at this boy, his boy, and saw the only legacy that had ever mattered. The phone buzzed again. This time a photo. The infirmary. Maria's bed.
Empty.
Ernesto's blood turned to ice. The next message. "She died 2 hours ago. Alone. Because you weren't there. Because you chose to hide in the dark with her bastard instead of saying goodbye. Some father you are." Ernesto's hand shook, the phone nearly slipping from his grip. Maria.
Gone.
And he hadn't been there. Hadn't held her hand. Hadn't told her he was sorry for being weak, for being fooled, for letting 30 years disappear like smoke. "Papa?" Ernesto looked down. Mateo was awake, those dark eyes, Maria's eyes, staring up at him. "She's gone," Ernesto whispered. "Your mother. She's..." Mateo didn't cry, didn't scream, just nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this, as if loss was a language he'd learned young. "She said you'd come back to yourself eventually," the boy said quietly. "Said the man she loved was still in there somewhere, just buried deep. I don't know if that man exists anymore. Then become someone new." Mateo sat up, his child's voice carrying a weight that belonged to someone much older. Someone who doesn't let other people's debts destroy everything good. Ernesto stared at his son, at this 8-year-old philosopher forged in poverty and grief, and made a decision. If the old Ernesto was dead, fine. Let him stay dead. But the new Ernesto, the one holding his son in a forgotten cellar, the one who'd chosen love over empire, that man had a war to win. Maria is gone. Ernesto has nothing left to lose. Like, if you're ready to see him burn it all down, subscribe. The final battle is coming. Comment. What would you do in Ernesto's position? Ernesto had built his empire on 3 foundations: fear, information, and loyalty bought with blood. Lorenzo had taught him that. What Lorenzo hadn't taught him was what happens when a man with nothing left to lose decides to detonate all 3 at once. The first domino fell at dawn. Ernesto sent a single message to every underboss, captain, and soldier in the organization, not from his official channels, but from the encrypted network Lorenzo thought only he controlled. The message contained 63 scanned letters in Maria's handwriting, documentation of Lorenzo's threats against her family, and bank records showing payments made to the men who'd disappeared, her brother and mother 15 years ago. The message included one line: "Your consigliera has been playing his own game. Ask yourselves who else he's manipulated. Ask yourselves who's next. The second domino fell at noon. Ernesto had spent 30 years collecting secrets. Every dirty deal, every hidden account, every skeleton in every closet of every man who'd ever sat at his table. He'd kept them as insurance, never imagining he'd weaponize them all at once. Now he did. Financial records went to the police. Evidence of corruption went to honest judges, the few who still existed. Information about family betrayals went to the families themselves, carefully placed to ignite old grudges and new wars. By sunset, 3 of the 5 families were at each other's throats. The commission was too busy managing internal chaos to worry about one rogue Don and his bastard son. The third domino fell at midnight. Ernesto walked into Lorenzo's penthouse alone, no weapons, no backup. Just a man with a promise to keep. Lorenzo was waiting, a gun on the table between them, surrounded by the last of his loyal men, 6 soldiers who'd chosen the consigliere over the Don. "You've destroyed everything," Lorenzo said, his silver hair disheveled for the first time in decades. 30 years of careful construction, gone because you found a whore's bastard in the slums. Ernesto didn't rise to the bait. "I didn't destroy it. I just showed everyone what it really was." He gestured at the chaos visible through the penthouse windows, sirens, fires, the city tearing itself apart. An empire built on lies and manipulation. "You taught me to see debts everywhere, Lorenzo. Well, I finally calculated yours. And what do I owe?" "Everything." Ernesto's voice was cold as winter. 30 years of Maria's life. 8 years of my son's childhood. Every moment of humanity you carved out of me to make me your weapon. Lorenzo laughed, a bitter sound. "You think you can collect? You think you walk out of here alive?" "I think," Ernesto said quietly, "that your men have been listening very carefully to what I've said. And I think they're doing the same math I did." He looked at the 6 soldiers. "How many of you have families? Children? People you love?" 3 of them shifted uncomfortably. How long before Lorenzo decides their liabilities too? How long before you become the next thing he erases to keep someone else ruthless? The gun on the table suddenly seemed very far away from Lorenzo's hand. "He's manipulating you," Lorenzo said quickly. "This is what he does." Ernesto Domenico doesn't care about family or love or... "You're right," Ernesto interrupted. "He didn't. But I'm not him anymore." 2 of the soldiers stepped away from Lorenzo. Then a third. Then all 6, leaving the consigliere alone in his perfect penthouse with his perfect lies crumbling around him. "You made me a king," Ernesto said. "Now watch me abdicate." He turned and walked away, leaving Lorenzo with the gun and the ruins of his empire and the crushing knowledge that he'd finally miscalculated. Behind him, a single gunshot echoed through the penthouse. Ernesto didn't look back. 3 months later, the slums looked exactly the same and completely different. Ernesto Domenico, former Don, former king, former monster, walked down the narrow street in plain clothes, his expensive suits abandoned like a snake's shed skin. Matteo walked beside him, wearing shoes that actually fit now, his hand occasionally brushing his father's as they navigated the morning crowd. They stopped at the place where it had all changed, where a pistol had fallen in the mud and rewritten both their futures. "Mama would have liked this," Matteo said quietly. Ernesto nodded. They'd buried Maria properly, had given her the funeral she deserved, had filled the infirmary with flowers until the nurses complained. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. "What do we do now?" Matteo asked. It was a good question. Ernesto had liquidated his remaining assets, had paid off debts both legal and illegal, had created trust funds for the families of men he'd killed. He'd done what he could to clean up the mess of his old life. But cleaning up wasn't the same as building something new. "I was thinking," Ernesto said slowly, "about your mother's brother. The one Lorenzo killed. He used to run a youth center here, didn't he? Before. Mateo's eyes widened. You want to. Someone needs to give these kids an option besides joining families like mine. Ernesto looked around at the slums, at the children watching them with wary eyes, at the cycle of poverty and violence that had devoured so many lives. Someone needs to show them there's another way out. That's going to take a long time.
Years.
Maybe decades. Good thing I've got time now. Ernesto looked down at his son, his legacy, his redemption, his second chance. And good thing I've got help. Mateo smiled, and Ernesto saw Maria in that smile, saw hope and possibility, and everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. They walked on together through the slums, not as predator returning to hunting grounds, but as builders assessing a foundation. The street dogs didn't scatter this time. The children didn't hide. And when Ernesto's shadow fell across the mud where his pistol had once landed, he didn't even notice. He was too busy listening to his son talk about the future, about possibilities, about the kind of legacy that couldn't be stolen or destroyed or bought with blood. Behind them, the morning sun painted the laundry lines gold, turning poverty into something almost beautiful, something almost like hope. Ernesto had spent 30 years learning how to take. Now he would spend whatever remained learning how to give. It wasn't redemption. That was too clean a word for what he'd done. But it was a start. And for a man who'd once believed only in debts and fear, a start was more than he'd ever thought he deserved. The end. Did Ernesto's redemption hit you in the feels? Smash that like button. Subscribe for more intense stories. Comment below. What's your favorite moment from Ernesto and Mateo's journey? Let's talk.